Functional threshold power, or FTP, is what has been going for 10, 20 years. So it's very common. Andy Coggan, they came up with the book, How to Do Cycling Training Power with Power. So functional threshold power is typically your 60-minute maximum power that you can do.
Yeah. But you don't test that, do you, typically? Because it's scary to think about that.
Yeah, it's the best way to get your functional threshold power is your 60-minute maximum effort, but good luck to you.
Yeah.
I wouldn't recommend it to anyone that I would coach to do a 60-minute maximum effort because it's very hard.
I did it once on a trainer, almost killed myself.
I would never do it myself.
Yeah.
So to get your functional threshold power, you would do the typical test is a 5 and a 20-minute effort. So you use the 5-minute all-out effort as your fatiguing, anaerobic fatiguing effort to get your 20-minute maximum power, which is your aerobic threshold.
So you do a 5-minute all-out, have a recovery, and then do a 20-minute all-out?
Yeah.
And then you take
95% of your 20-minute average power.
Okay. But no one does that. They just do the 20-minute, don't they?
Yeah, a lot of people do the 20-minute because it's quite overwhelming to do a 5-minute all-out effort before you do a 20-minute all-out effort. And I think people think, if I can just do the 20-minute effort, I'll have a better threshold.
Yeah.
Or I'll have a better FTP, but that's not how it works.
Yeah.
It's not the protocol how it was designed to do. So
do you think though that the kind of is difficult for people to do that because they're not conditioned and they don't know how to do sustained efforts?
Yeah, 100%. So that's why we like to use a half Monty, for example, because it's on the indoor trainer and it's easy to do because it's right there in front of you.
What is the half Monty?
Half Monty is on Wahoo system. It's a ramp test to exhaustion, which you can do the same thing on Zwift, but the difference with the half Monty is that it has a 20-minute sustained effort afterwards, and it's not all out. It's quite easy to achieve. Your heart rate's typically sub-threshold, so it's looking at how that affects how your aerobic system is handling that sort of effort. So going out and doing two maximum efforts, not knowing what you can actually do for 20 minutes, that's hard to pace. So typically, first time you do a max test, it's a learning process. So you'll get improvement from doing any testing just from the learning effect. So in research, when they do research like a controlled research, they will do the test first. That's not part of the research. It's just getting an understanding for what that test feels like. So they will do a ramp test to exhaustion to get them familiar with the test because they know that there's a learning process. It's the exact same thing. So if you do the 5 and 20 minute initially at the start of a program, if you're 6 to 8 weeks in, you do another one, you'll probably get an improvement just from the learning effect and how to do that test and how it feels. But you'll also get a benefit from being physiologically better as well, but there's a learning effect in there as well. So anytime you do a test first time, it's going to be overwhelming. But that 5 and 20 minute is quite overwhelming to do the 25 minutes of maximum effort.
Absolutely. So there are obviously different protocols to get your FTP. You've just spoken about 3 essentially, and there's more. But once you've got your FTP, what does that mean?
That will just define your zone, so your training zone. So on a typical model, your functional threshold power is in the middle of zone 4. Your functional threshold power will change from day to day based on how you're feeling and how your body's responding. So that's also a consideration with any threshold that your body athlete needs to know themselves, but it will set your zones. So essentially your threshold it's not the point where your lactate changes or your lactate threshold. So if you're doing another test to determine your threshold, not functional threshold power, it's your lactate threshold. So there's heaps of different types of thresholds. It's very overwhelming, so that's why we're trying to talk about them a bit. So it's not as overwhelming. If someone typed in threshold to Google, it's which one do I do?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I guess we at the RCA we use the half Monty because it's practical for amateurs that haven't done much sustained efforts before. They get their FTP, they can work out their 7 training zones, and then they can go train to structure. We can get them to do zone 2 rides, threshold rides, anaerobic rides, and so forth. Now we've covered that. Tell me about critical power. What is that, and how do you get that?
So with the researchers, and critical power has been a thing for a little while now.
What's a little while? Because I don't hear much about it.
Over 5 years. Within research, it's been commonly talked about, and it's more and more has been coming out recently. But it's been common for over 5 years now. But it's the issue that researchers were having with functional threshold power is there was no scientific backing behind it. It was something that Andy Coggan and et cetera came up with 20 years ago, 25 years ago when power first became a thing and they wanted to define zones and give a definition for a threshold. Critical power has research, it's backed by research. So they're looking at a power curve on the athlete. So critical power is very different from functional threshold power in the sense that functional threshold power is about 60 minutes, your maximum effort. Critical power, it's very varying depending on the type of athlete, so elite versus amateur, but it's around that 30 to 40 minute of max effort, again, depending on how.
So it's estimating, as opposed to estimating your 1 hour, it's estimating 30 to 40 minutes.
Yes.
So does that mean you do a 30 to 40 minute test?
No, so you use, this is the big benefit of critical power, is it uses multiple parameters. So we use 2 to 3, sometimes 4 measurements, maximum efforts. So it plots it on a power curve. So 20-minute effort, you're just using that 20-minute effort. We don't care about the 5-minute power. It gives us an indicator of how good you are at 5 minutes. But we use the 20-minute as your functional threshold power.
And that sort of tells you everything, basically.
That tells you everything.
Even though it doesn't really.
And it doesn't tell you anything about what type of athlete you are either. So 20 minutes very... if you're a really good aerobic athlete, you get a really good 20-minute power. If you're a really good anaerobic athlete, you may not have a very good 20-minute power. So critical power, where it's becoming more popular, is you can do, the tests typically range from anywhere from 2 to 15 minutes. So you can do 2, 3, 4, sometimes 4 max efforts. Typically you would do a 3 and a 12-minute max, which is very common. And there's a lot of calculators out there online and a lot of different models that you can use. But if we just look at the 3 and 12 minutes, you look at 3 minute as essentially your anaerobic power. So you're looking at how that energy system looks over time. So we can work anaerobic capacity for a particular block, and we can see how that changes over time. And we look at 12 minutes, which is typically your aerobic power. So similar to what you would look at for a 20-minute. There's not much change from 12 to 15 minutes to 20 minutes. You can do within 5 to 10% of what you can do for 20 minutes. So it's the same sort of aerobic capacity. And we can look at how that changes over time as well. So if you look at a power curve, you're 3 minutes up here, you're 12 minutes here, it comes down. And it flattens off the further it goes across.
And it guesstimates that 30 to 40 minute.
Guesstimates that 30 to 40 minute, and you can use that as a threshold as well. But it's very variable depending on what type of athlete you are. So if you're an amateur athlete, there's some science out there that says it's pretty close to what your functional threshold power would be, just because the power is quite lower. So for example, if we looked at an athlete who has a functional threshold power, so 60 minutes at 250 watts. Their critical power, and this is from the research, is estimated between around 260. So you got a 10 watt difference. It's not that much difference. If you went up to the scale of pros, they got a 400 watt FTP, for example. So they can do 400 watts theoretically for 1 hour. Scary. Very hard to do, very hard to fathom. But the difference there, so if you look at a 5% difference there, you're looking at 20 watts is 5%. So if you look at 10 watts, their critical power may be 440 watts. So that's a pretty big difference. So it's quite different from that perspective, that elite athletes can get a really high critical power because they can push themselves a lot harder for 12 minutes, for example, than 20 minutes because they know how to suffer. Same with the 3 minute effort. Their 3 minute effort might be 600 watts for a world tour athlete. That's huge. So the variability from critical power to functional threshold power is very different for elite pro athletes. So you look at it very differently versus an amateur athlete, where those parameters are quite similar in terms of actual power, like raw data. 10 watts is not that much difference, whereas 40 watts that's a big difference. So we can not use them interchangeably, but you can use them and look at how that's changing over time a lot closer than you would at an elite athlete level.
So with FTP, you plug it into a calculator and you get your 7 training zones. With critical power, you know in your example, you know your 3 minute and you know your 12 minute. I know you can test different variables. But are you plugging it into a calculator? Do you get your zones? Like, how are you using it?
You can use it as, that's why they mentioned the elite versus amateur. So yes, we can use it as a threshold and we can use it as your threshold marker, but you need to be aware that you may not be able to do the same efforts as you would as a functional threshold, same number. So for example, if you were doing I don't know, 4 by 10 minute thresholds, if you were doing that at a functional threshold power, that might be quite achievable. But if you were doing 4 10-minute threshold efforts at your critical power, that's quite difficult, because it's essentially 30-minute maximum effort versus a 60-minute or 60-minute. So it's quite different. So you just need to be aware of that. Right. And as an athlete, you're probably going to use functional threshold power more as your actual threshold. But critical power, what I'm using it as, is another measure over time of how you're performing and how your energy systems are changing.
So you're using it to complement FTP. You're not actually replacing FTP?
No.
It's complementing.
Yeah, it's complementing. Okay. So I don't want to fully change how everything works, because we've been using functional threshold power for a long time, and that's how the zones were designed. So in future, there might be zone models where it's a critical power zone model.
Yes.
But at the moment, you use it to complement. So at the RCA, we use a benchmark test. So you would do your half Monty, for example, to get your functional threshold power, and then we use benchmark test as another measurement to see how you're improving over time. With critical power, that is essentially a benchmark test. So we can do...
So the benchmark climb would be recommended between, say, maybe not 3 minutes, because you can't get much out of a 3-minute climb from a time perspective. If you're looking to beat your time, but maybe a 5 to a 12-minute climb.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a really good way to show, okay, well, I'm okay with a 3-minute benchmark test, because that shows anaerobic power and it shows how that's changing over time. But we can look at, in critical power, use 3 to 4 models. So you can do 3-minute, 5-minute, 8-minute, and 12-minute, for example, if you were looking at all the models. You typically use 3, 5, and 12. 5 minutes, you're pretty close to your maximal aerobic power. So if you look at that and how that changes over time, if we did a test, and athletes, as they would know, you're not always going to test the best on one particular day. So if we did a 3 and a 12-minute on one day, you may have had a really good improvement in those, and your 5-minute, you're pretty fatigued for some reason, whatever reason. You're up late last night, or work was really stressful, so that came down a little bit. But we can say, oh, well, you still improved 3 and 12 minutes. Yes, your 5-minute was down, but there's a reason for it.
Right.
We've got 3 measures there to look at how you improved over time. So 3-minute improve, anaerobic capacity's up. We've done some anaerobic work. If your 12 minutes stayed the same, then, okay, we need to work a bit more on that aerobic power, that threshold effort, to bring that up to match the improvement in anaerobic threshold.
Yeah, okay. Interesting.
They would typically go together. So if you're doing anaerobic work, your threshold would increase as well. So they typically go like this, but sometimes they don't. So we just look back at the training and say, oh, why did that happen? Let's work more on your threshold. You might need more of that threshold stimulus to improve that area.
And you were saying off camera that one of the big benefits of training to critical power is something to do with measuring how much energy you spend as well. So that's a real advantage people can use in training.
Yeah, so this is another big benefit of critical power, is that it also gives you a value called watt prime.
And you get that in one of the calculators that we can link to below?
Yeah, so you'll get your critical power in your watt prime number, which is measured in energy, or joules. So it'll gives you how much energy you have in reserve. So for example, you may have a critical power of 300 watts. You have anywhere from 10 to 15,000 joules remain as an energy store in your body.
Right.
Whenever you go over that 300 watt mark, you're using that energy store. So under 300 watts, you are using energy, but you're not tapping into that critical energy, that critical power that you need to perform at the end of a race, for example. Mm-hmm. So if we did a 350 watt effort, we may use 10,000. A 5-minute effort over critical power, you may have 5,000 joules left in your body to consume after that. So that's when you hit the wall. The wall is very different, but from a critical power and a watt prime model, we can see what's happening in that watt prime and how much energy you'll have left after efforts.
Right.
So if we do a set of VO2, a typical VO2 session is 5 by 3 minutes at VO2.
Yep.
You would look at after the first effort, you may have, I don't know, out of a 15,000 watt joule energy overall you've got, you may have 8,000 left after the first effort. You do that, replenishes a little bit, comes up to say 10,000, then you do the next one, it goes down to 7. You do the next one, comes up to 9, and then it goes down to 5 or 6. Right. And then by the end of it, you're pretty empty because you're going at the max efforts. So we can look at how much energy you have left and talk to the athlete and be like, okay, you still had 5,000 joules left of energy after that session. Did you feel like you had that? Or no, I was completely empty. Well, why is there this model? It's not exact science. It's estimating how much energy you have left, but why have you still got energy left? Can we tap into that extra energy from a particular performance?
So it gives you an extra tool in your kit bag for a, say, high-intensity interval training session, rather than rate of perceived exertion where you think maybe you could have done one more, but you're not really sure. You can also leverage something like this.
Exactly. It's just another analysis tool. Like there's so many ways to analyze sessions and analyze efforts out there, but it just gives us another perspective. And I think it's used more in high performance. It's not necessarily used more in amateur. Because in high performance, you always want to get that 1%. Like the guys at the Tour de France, they're looking at, okay, I finished this stage of the Tour de France with zero energy. Like I am absolutely spent. So the nutritionists, the coaches and sports dietitians, they will be, you need to have this amount of energy. You need to replenish all of this glycogen. Whereas if you finish it and you got 10,000 joules left, for example, after a mountaintop finish, you're like, okay, maybe I don't need to replenish as much energy.
Okay.
So they're looking at how much you've got left within your muscles. So the typically you're looking at that's the joules, or watt prime is how much you have in your actual muscles in your liver.
Right.
Before you start taking in carbohydrates, for example.
Right. Okay, so I think it would be fair to say that critical power is a great complementary tool for functional threshold power for those amateur and recreational athletes that are looking to take the next step.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. It's very valuable as an extra measure of performance, how you're improving over time. So that's typically how you would use it.